David, it is great to have you here in this online portion of the BGI, Beneficial General Intelligence event. It would have been cool to have you at the face-to-face part in Panama. On the other hand, we'll get more people online than we will in any one location. So this is also certainly a fantastic way to participate, and it's as we all know, it's never been a more interesting time to be talking about AI and its implications, including AGI and its implications. So you've been around the space of AI and policy and AI's implications for some time, and you've been involved in a leadership role in quite a number of impactful organizations. Maybe we could start by you giving just a 1 or 2 minute rundown of your own experiences in this domain, sort of before it became such a popular thing to be thinking about.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, thank you, Ben, and thank you for all that you're doing, especially with the conference. Again, yes, wish I could be there, but at least we can begin to explore the conversation of how do either of us know that it's really us as opposed to a generative deepfake that is presenting to you at the moment. Although this is maybe where I say, I swear, Judge, I'm not a cat. But anyway, so my own experience, yes, I've had the fortune to be at the vanguard of technologies that were used in exquisite settings, ranging from bioterrorism preparedness response, or thinking about DoD, Department of Defense satellites and how they might be used, that were at the cusp of becoming more available both commercially and to the public. And so that involved expert systems back in the 1990s, which was a class of AI. Later was involved with bioterrorism preparedness response, including responding to the events of 9/11, the anthrax events in 2001. But also we knew about the original coronavirus, later known as severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. And I can share that two ways we knew about it about 5.5 months before those things unfolded. Was that one, the price of garlic went up tenfold in Southeast Asia, where it's seen as a cure-all. And so if you see these economic indicators of prices increasing, if it's seen as a possible tip in queuing of something going on. The other way we knew was the increased reflectivity of cars in parking lots. And sure enough, if you fast forward to what happened with COVID in the lead up to 2020, the same price spike happened. And this time, instead of using government satellites to see that there was increased reflectivity of cars in parking lots around hospitals, as opposed to other places, you could actually see it with commercial satellites. And so it's interesting to have seen how the different flavors of AI that were used in these different processes and analyses shifted from decision support systems, expert systems. Later, you saw a lot of natural language processing, a lot of network analysis that was very big in 2010. Obviously, deep learning and then machine learning, both coming onto the scenes. And then now, of course, we see generative AI. And I think that's important because it's worth noting that when we talk about AI and what may come next with AGI or something like that, it's worth noting that there's many different flavors enclosed and captured in AI, and that we may actually discover that deep learning may not be the only path to goodness. There may be other approaches that include active inference. I know Carl Friston is pushing a lot for this, and it may even be hybrid approaches. The other thing that I would also say from my experiences, both doing AI and decision support in space, AI and decision support in the healthcare and biospace, also in crisis environments for countering disinformation, because I've actually done a lot both to help with countering disinformation, actually experiencing a disinformation attack myself, but then also thinking about where we're going next as societies. We have to think not just about the flavor of AI we want to use for a different task at hand, or the different flavors, plural, but also context matters, because what you're going to be doing if it's a case of recommending something for you to possibly purchase or buy or lease is going to be dramatically different than, say, making a decision about your healthcare and how you're going to have a personalized healthcare plan if you're already sick. And there's many different contexts that come into play. And so if I could think of a triangle, I would think about both the flavors of AI that we should be thinking about, the context, and then finally at the sort of the bottom of the inverted triangle, think about how we can make sure things are people and community centric, and involve as multiple stakeholders as possible around how things are done if it's really a community activity as opposed to an individualist activity.
Yeah, I've thought about AI ethics issues as falling into three categories, very broadly speaking. So one category is sort of good or bad things that AI systems are doing right now, and I mean they're helping people in various ways, and they can be biased against certain races, they could be misogynist, they could be denying people credit based on unfair reasons and so on. Then then there's risks to the social fabric and the economy. Like if AI obsoletes a whole bunch of job categories, what does society do? Do we retrain people? Do we give them UBI? How does it work? And what does AI do to warfare? Will it make nasty dictators kill more people, right? And then there's the existential risks, right? Like, when AI becomes AGI and superintelligence, will it squash everybody, or turn us into batteries, or mulch us and turn us into synthesis gas, or to power its generators or something, right? And as I think the issues you're raising are more on the first side I mentioned, sort of verging into the second. But it's also interesting how all three of these may interdepend. Like it may be the best way to ward off long-term risks is to have AI doing things that are beneficially wrapped up with human pursuit in the short term, right? And that's I think often overlooked. Like people are worried about the Terminator or something, but actually someone would have to build that and roll it out. And if I mean, eventually not. Eventually the AIs will build each other, but initially someone's building that system. So, okay, well, what if we're building nursing assistants and teaching assistants, and what if we're building decision support systems for businesses rather than building AIs whose job it is to murder people? Well, then maybe once they get smarter and smarter and move toward real AGI and superintelligence, maybe they'll still be positive and friendly, right? Like and helpful. We can't guarantee it, but it seems at least a sensible way to think. I wonder along these lines, like what's your feeling? I mean, you've had more to do with the government and policymakers recently than I have. Like I lived in DC from 2001 to 2010 or 11. Mostly was dealing with either biology stuff like NIH, FDA, or some intelligence stuff rather than policy stuff. But there are many smart people there. The collective intelligence in the institutions there is often less than the sum of the parts. It seemed like to me. So I wonder what's your thinking about sort of the level of understanding of AI issues in government policy circles, and like how do you think a meaningful regulatory function for AI could be created? Like you want to avoid things like US financial regulatory apparatus or US medical regulatory apparatus, which are just captured by big corporations and are just very slow to adapt, right? Like regulation of airline industry works okay, but it takes a long time to roll out a new kind of airplane, right? AI is much more rapidly evolving, which seems to necessitate a different sort of approach. Yeah, what's your thinking in this sort of area?
Right. So there's a lot there. So let me see if I can parse it into three parts. And what I loved about what you first said is actually, my early experiences working on the front line with government initially with small satellites, and then later with bioterrorism preparedness response with 9/11 and other events that followed, actually motivated me to go get a PhD focusing on how we can use technology and humans to make better decisions and better performance outcomes, and vice versa. And I actually later did collective intelligence at MIT with Tom Malone. So you mentioned collective intelligence, and it's worth noting that actually one of the progenitors back in the very, very early days of AI, very early days, was Herbert Simon, who also worked, interesting enough, he did his dissertation looking at decision making in New York state government, I believe. Whether or not that later motivated him to actually go do AI, not sure, but he came to the theory of bounded rationality, that humans are often sometimes captive to where they currently know things and going too far outside the status quo, sometimes for whatever reason, is pushed back by an organization. And so I would say, in some respects, if you there's a wonderful quote that's from the Federalist Papers that says, "What is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all humans were angels, no government would be necessary." And so there's lots of checks and balances in the
Well,
system.
I mean, in the Christian heaven has a pretty strict hierarchical government over the angels, actually.
Oh well, yeah. So this was more of just pointing out that you want ambition to counter ambition in our government.
And if you read the City of God by Saint Augustine, there's a quite elaborate hierarchy over the angels and archangels and all that, right? So,
right. But if you think of more of the traditional sense that when we were thinking about setting up our representative form of government in the United States and the whole debate with the Federalist Papers, it was a recognition that humans are humans, and that some humans are going to do good things. A lot of humans are going to do a lot of mundane things like cat videos or things like that, and some are going to be a little bit more self-interested or selfish. And there's a wonderful quote in that same Federalist Papers number 51 that talks about ambition to counter ambition, which would lead to the next step, because you were talking about, what do we do about what happens if AI somehow starts going in bad directions or is used for bad? And I would actually sort of posit we could replace the word AI at the moment with the words organization or companies or corporations or any type of human organization, and raise the same questions. Like, what's our checks and balances if an organization decides to start doing things that are not in the interest of either consumers or citizens or the world, but decides to go on a mission that is completely is detrimental to the world. And in fact, we're dealing with that in some cases. There are regional conflicts currently going on in the world where that's the place. And we have responses. They're not perfect and it's not easy. But I would say, if AI is simply fast organizations, or if organizations are slow AI, we should probably think about defense in depth of how do we make sure we encourage the better angels, in the metaphorical angel sense, of all these entities. And actually everything you raised about the concerns about how AI might be making unjust decisions or maybe discriminating, these are all very serious issues. But I would submit they were very serious issues before AI came on the scene as well. And they were not being addressed. And so in some respects, we have a lot of unjust and things that need to be fixed in our society, regardless of whether AI is present or not. AI may serve as, unfortunately, kerosene on gas fire in some cases. But I would say what we really need to go back to first principles and say, what kind of society do we want separate from AI? And then as we include AI, how can that amplify the better parts of humanity working together, regardless of whether AI is there or not? But I do think sometimes AI, while yes, there are concerns and we need to think through them, sometimes serves right now as a scapegoat for misdirection of the issues that are already present in society.
Yeah, I think that's wise. I mean, I think I've had similar thoughts with cryptocurrency regulation, and that, I mean, like, fraud is already illegal, and pretty much all the big crypto guys who have been busted and going to jail and so on, I mean, these guys are just doing fraud. They're stealing money, they're lying, they're false advertising. I mean, we don't need special laws to outlaw that. And I think for fake news and deep fake pictures and all this, again, there's a question of enforcement and identification. But I mean, we actually don't need a lot of new laws to make it illegal to make a bot impersonating someone and then stealing money with that bot, right? Like that's already illegal. So it seems there there's often an emotional desire, like we got to make a law against that, but actually, it's
It's
not.
already there.
Yeah, I mean, we have too many laws because it's easy to put laws into place, and then people don't want to take time to get rid of them, and then technological solutions to actually helping with the problems in practice just take a long time to roll out, even when they're clear. So, for example, I mean, a lot of deep fake problems and fake news image problems and stuff can be solved with watermarking, right? Like you could have all the manufacturers put in their camera a watermark that goes in the image, like was taken by this device at this time at this place, right? By this person. Cryptography can deal with that. I mean, then it doesn't solve everything. There could be an archival picture from a long time ago that somebody scanned, but I mean, it helps with a lot of things, right? But that would require cooperation of a lot of different parties across a lot of different countries. It will happen. But some friends of mine pitched this idea to Interpol like 5 years ago, and the Interpol guys could see it, but they're not the only ones. I mean, who would need to be involved in doing it, right? So I mean, in a similar way, like, could you take a large language model and could you train it in a way that let it trace back what sources each answer relied on? Like, you could do that. Like, mathematically, I could write down how you do that. It will be more expensive to train that model, right? And so one thing you could do is try to pass a law saying everyone must train models that will allow you to trace sources of every response. But that will not be popular. Big tech companies won't like it and consumers won't necessarily like it because within the budget that you have available now, that would make products worse, right? On the other hand, should we be funding research on how to make models like that without incurring a humongous cost? We certainly should be, right? Like, if you get like Signal, the secure messaging company, has like 50 people or something in its team.
Yeah, much smaller.
because
Yeah.
because they're not doing advertising. So most of what the tech companies are doing is not even working on the core products that people are using. It's working on advertising, right? So I mean, if a little bit of all the money spent on advertising was spent on things like making models that are more transparent and can cite what their sources are, I mean, probably it is a tractable problem, right? So there's often routes to solving what not necessarily fully solving, but there's often routes to helping a lot with the issues that we see with AI that are hard to undertake given industry structure and given geopolitical structure, but yet probably easier than making meaningful legislation that would really help the problem, right?
Well, so yeah, I mean, there's a lot there as well. So I would say, I mean, what you observed is, if anything, the really tricky part is the actual operationalizing what we do differently now that AI and other flavors of AI and future advances are coming on the scene. Because in some respects, we still want public works. We still want law enforcement. We still want a civil society. Like, that has not changed. Now, we may want to address some past injustices that need to be fixed. Yes, good. That was the case even regardless of AI. But now that AI is on the scene, how do these civil functions continue to do the work? And it runs headlong into consistent with the values of our Constitution, which, while not a perfect document, is sort of a guiding North Star. And so, where you pointed out the example of, do we put watermarks that are embedded automatically by a camera? There may be some autocratic nations that do surveillance states that would absolutely love that. The question is that something that our nation, that right now believes in the freedom of speech, the freedom to have dissent, peacefully, protest and things like that, would that be something that would edge us closer or further away from the values in that? And that's a harder thing to figure out. And so, what I would love in some respects is finding those sandboxes where you bring people that are both tech experts, but also people that have challenges in terms of, because a lot of when people lament, when they're like, well, why can't government just do that? It's like, because these things are oftentimes multifactorial, and what we need are more people coming in that are willing to take the time to understand how challenging it is to implement it, because we get the government we deserve. And it's not a quick fix. It can't just be solved by a website. And so I think in some respects, sadly, the next few years, autocrats or more singular societies that are either homogeneous in nature or homogeneous by thought and force will have an easier time addressing new technologies than those that are more pluralistic, where there's a lot of different, there's techno-optimists, there's techno-fatalists, there's pessimistic, there's skeptics. That's a lot harder because you're going to have such divergent opinions on how these things should be rolled out. Finding a way to move the needle, and in some respects, we got to go back to first principles on data. We somehow, the world propagated the meme a few years ago that data was the new oil. I'm like, no, oil, use it up, it's gone. Data, use it, it's still there. If anything, by hoarding it, you're actually missing the chance for the community to figure out how it should best be used and refining it and making it better. So there's a lot of lessons on data even before we get to AI that we have to unlearn, in my opinion. But if we can create these sandboxes that bring diverse folks to actually envision the next, and maybe we translate. I know David Brin is speaking as well at this event. If we get sci-fi authors to give us hopeful narratives of the future, then that's something we can aim for. Even if we don't get to the Star Trek future, if we have hopeful narratives, we can at least work towards them.
Yeah, I think I hope it's not true that we get the government we deserve. That's
we get the government we deserve if we don't help out. Now, I say is there's a lot of learned helplessness. There's people that are easy to say, somebody else figure that out. It's like, we are the calvary. If you don't step up, don't be surprised that nobody else does.
Yeah, I mean that's there's a lot of whole is less than the sum of the parts going on in political domains. And
so what I'm saying is, but that's not just political. So partly when I looked at collective decision making in organizations, a lot of the reasons why you see the performance outcomes you do in collective intelligence settings is the incentives and the disincentives present, the normative values that are
that's an interesting point, right? Because like sometimes of course the whole is way more than the sum of the parts, and almost all successful software startups are that way. I mean a successful army fighting is that way too. All the our music band is that way. So I mean there can be
sometimes the crowd is wise and sometimes the crowd is a mob.
Well, I'm not sure how it's interesting. I think a couple of things are interesting. Well, many things are interesting there. One question that pops to mind is, so what are the patterns in organizational structure and culture that distinguish, a effective versus a counterproductive group, collective superintelligence versus collective hyper stupidity or whatever. Another question is how do these factors change as the organization scales, and how are they different for more centralized versus decentralized organizations, both of which can be effective, right? And so these are all, because it seems like for fostering the growth of beneficial general intelligence, we need effective small tightly knit organizations like to build the software, but you also need somehow an effective decentralized large organization pulling in a lot of people from around the world without a central controller toward guiding general intelligence in a beneficial direction. And I don't know that, I mean, like the Linux community works, the internet community in some senses works as like broad decentralized movements that are pulling something off, but it's
sort of works. I would say the internet works in general, but I would also say, how are we doing on cybersecurity? And anyone can say that we're better off on cybersecurity than we were 10 years ago.
Well, I mean, that's internet works in the sense that Iran is on the internet, and I can exchange research with people in University of Isfahan, and they can put code in GitHub and papers on archive.org. So it sort of works as a parallel infrastructure for
Oh
science
yeah,
and
but
technology.
ransomware in 2019 was $11 billion in estimated damages. A year later, 20 billion. A year later, it was
These
43
privacy
billion.
spy things are
Well,
complicated.
ransomware is not spy. Ransomware is just they're in it for the money.
No. But what I mean is, you'll have defenses, then you'll have attacks, then you'll have defenses, then
Oh
you'll
yeah,
have
oh
attacks, then
yeah,
you'll have
and that's
defenses,
true in
then you'll
everything in your
have attacks.
environment. Is is
And
is I mean,
it
you
seems
know,
like the nature of it is, we only want to allocate resources to security when it's desperate. So we're always going to be just one little step away, little step ahead of the bad guys. And again, that's about incentives, because the incentive to stop an urgent disaster is very high. The incentive to put money into bolstering against a possible future attack that's not currently about to kill you is
representative forms of government are hard to
low.
motivate to deal with long-term, far-out things that are not within their electoral cycles.
Yeah,
So go
yeah.
ahead.
Thus the U.S. national debt and a lot of
Yeah,
social security, a lot of other
yeah.
problems, right? But
Thus, climate change.
yeah, but what do you think is the best wisdom about growing a sort of large decentralized network of people to be impactful about something important and rapidly evolving?
Yeah, I mean, so part of what I showed when I did do my PhD, both based on how I had my experiences in the private and the public sector, and again, private sector doesn't have a monopoly on smartness as opposed to the government. I mean, I did work for some tech companies in the '90s in which some of them said the internet was a fad and I should go back to client server. Why was I doing the internet? So you know, let's recognize humans everywhere sometimes are misled by whatever the incentives are present, and if they're even a startup in 5 to 8 years will start to have ossification if they're not intentional about keeping their incentives to keep people sort of in some respects hungry for what's next. But what I found is you have to empower the edge. And so that gets to your question about decentralizing is what does that look like? And I think in some respects, if you look at what's already happening in the world, both sadly because of regional conflicts, but also because of climate change induced changes in patterns of weather, there's some stats that say 1 in 4 of us currently will be displaced sometime in our lifetime for more than 3 months from our home due to climate change. And so I tell people, all of us are displaced people, we just don't know yet. And so what does that mean for the future of public services? How do we bring tech to bear to actually make sure those things are provided to help people in need if they are displaced from their house because of a crisis or climate change? But then also, like you said, is there a way to have a collective wisdom of the crowd from those people brought together? And what it shows is neurodiversity, diversity of perspectives, diversity of philosophies, and things and the like will help you if you can create a large enough umbrella where people feel like they all have bought into whatever is the overriding goal of the effort. I think we are lacking overriding goals, not just in the United States, but globally. And in some respects, it may be near impossible to have that globally. But I would love to see again, let's pick 2 to 3 very simple things where we all agree. Like we should solve world hunger before 2030, if not sooner. We should make sure everybody has access to potable water. These are all UN SDGs that supposedly we agreed to. If those are the overriding goals, then let's get people together, not just to think about how we work towards it, but almost in some respects backcast from that given future that by 2030, companies, governments, and communities solved making sure nobody went hungry in the world. Okay? Then how do we work backwards from it? And is there a role that AI played in helping to make that happen? And that's how I would operationalize it, because you need to create that big tent that pulls everybody together and then moves it forward. But if you're going to count on any one figure to make it happen, it's probably not going to happen. But if you have a million individual hands, each contributing their wisdom to how we solve this problem of world hunger or potable water, or how do we help displaced people, those are all futures that I think we can all agree we want to help those people, regardless of nationality or identity, and build towards that future.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. So I think one thing on my mind is, in this regard, suppose you pull together a diverse group of people who are diverse in culture and in knowledge base and neurodiverse and so forth, then what's the best way to leverage their collective understanding toward toward how to solve these problems. Like I've spent a bunch of time in Africa, especially Ethiopia, and one thing I see there is international NGOs. They spend a lot of their money paying like 30-year-old white people to go there and write reports, whereas they don't want to trust giving money to local people because they think local people will steal it, which some of them will, some of them won't. On the other hand, it's the local people who usually understand how to actually solve the problem, even if they're not as good at writing a correctly formatted report explaining in NGOEs how to solve the problem. So you see now about some of the precise problems you're discussing. You see there is knowledge about how to solve these things, which is not too effectively leveraged, even in cases where we're spending money supposedly on solving the things, right? And it seems
Well, so again, it gets to a question of it. So I will give you a positive example.
we have the core technology for this, right? I mean, we can ask people what they think. We can ask an LLM to summarize it and apply it to different things. So it's not like we don't have all these people have phones, and we even have machine translation if people don't know English, right? So it seems like we have the ability to collect and synthesize this knowledge and turn it into plans that actualize this knowledge, but the organizational structures are differently oriented at the moment.
Well, so yeah, so actually, just had a conversation with a fellow friend and colleague about a successful example. So let me give you a successful example that can inform how we could do things differently. Noting that you talked about organization systems being flawed, that same person, Herb Simon, who was one of the forefathers of AI, also did the science of the artificial, and he talked about how organizations we can generate different types of organizations that operate differently if we're not happy with it. Organizations are artificial; they're not physical properties of the universe, and same thing can be true for AI. And so, what I would raise is, so there's the Marshall Islands. Sadly, there's rising sea levels that's causing splashover events that's impacting their potable water table. And so, at some point in time, could be 10 years from now, could be later, could be sooner, we don't know exactly, they're going to have to leave their islands. And that's more than 77,000 people. And so in the Marshall Islands itself, there is a group that is 100% Marshallese. So it's 100% the local folks that have a board, that have an executive director, that are there to identify what they want to do to get ready for this event. There is the Office of Naval Research that is providing funding for that group to solicit from the world at large ideas as to what they could do. But ultimately, it's the folks on the ground. Again, it's back to empowering the edge that picks from those ideas what they want to do and then puts them into place. And so you're linking, in some respects, experts from around the world that may not be Marshallese themselves, but you're making sure it's Marshallese led, Marshallese empowered, Marshallese evaluated with that board and executive director. No tech needed. In some respects, it's a very motivated way. But I share that because it's a good way to link both local insights and local expertise with crowdsourcing expertise around the world for what does it mean if these people actually have to leave their islands in 10 or so years, and what will it mean for them to truly become at that point in time, global citizens, because they'll have lost their home because of climate change. And so that's just one example. But I think we, like you said, we can, with human organizations plus tech, find ways to have things be empowered at the local level.
The Marshall Islands is putting itself out there now as a jurisdiction for crypto companies. So maybe the islands will go underwater. You just have like an oil platform with a lawyer sitting on top of it, and then a database server. Right?
Well, and it does raise a question: what is a country? Is a country physically defined, or is a country defined by ideology?
Well, so far it is physically defined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
but at the same time, you can become an e-resident of Estonia without living in Estonia.
But you can't vote. E-residents
can't vote, but you can do business with Estonia and the EU as a result. And if we want to go even further back in time, you could become, without, even if you lived outside of Rome, you were born outside of Rome, there were ways you could actually become on a pathway to becoming a member of Rome And so this is not a new idea. Again, these are all artificial rules as to what we define. Like the Treaty of Westphalia defining geographical boundaries as sacrosanct. That's a fairly new invention. We can come up with something else.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to have to. I think a lot of the solutions that we're going to need to deal with are really re-envisioning the next, but doing so. And the trouble is, can we do this fast enough with a hopeful narrative? Because there's not much hopeful narratives out there at the moment. There's plenty of, whether it's climate change or somehow AI is going to become the Terminator, which I don't think it
Well,
will.
I'm extremely hopeful.
I'm
I
extremely
feel,
hopeful too, but we got to get that out there. I mean, you look at, unfortunately, imagine if you're right now a teenager, where are you going for sources of hope about what the next 10 to 15 years are going to have?
yeah, that it seems to vary a lot globally. I lived in Hong Kong for 10 years and moved back to the US 4 years ago. I think people were much more optimistic about AI and robotics and future technology in Asia on the whole than in the US. The assumption there seems to be these things will make people's lives better. They don't culturally, on the whole, tend so much toward pure utopianism either. Like this will solve everything, but nor do they tend so much toward it's going to kill us all, right?
Yes, the
It's
U.S.
more,
tends to be more extremes on either
yeah.
side.
The attitude is more like things will get better, then they'll get worse, then they'll get better, then they'll get worse. But we can see how these things will kind of lift up the wave, the wave, the wave overall. So I do think if you look globally, there's a lot of hopeful narratives, and I think the U.S. in some respects is an empire in relative decline, which brings this sort of attitude. Not that we're declining by absolute terms; it's just our superiority in some ways to the rest of the world is decreasing by a variety of measures, and I think that leads to a certain psychology among people who are like attached to being on top of the world. We're like, even if things are getting better, if they're not getting more better than everybody else, if their relative status isn't increasing, then they're not happy, even if their own lives are getting better. So I think there's some of that, but I think, yeah, certainly big tech is putting a lot of money into trying to give positive narratives about AI. Like if you look at the AI ads during the Super Bowl, it's all like, how can Microsoft Copilot help make your job better and so forth, right? So it seems there's a lot of money and attention going into making you sort of stop worrying and love the AI, right? So it's
Well, there's a lot of but I also think there's a lot of big tech that's also, I think I can remember it was about a year ago, and I actually wrote an article countering it that somehow said that AI was going to create horrors in terms of bio threats. And as one who countered bio, I will point out that sadly, this glass that I'm drinking from, I could break it and use it as a deadly weapon, which I'm not.
yeah,
But we're not talking about calling into glass or don't let glass get in the hand of AI. So on bio, the way you catch people that are using it for bad purposes is not limiting knowledge. In fact, I would say in an era of sadly in which WikiLeaks has happened, why do any of us think that you can limit knowledge either online for either
yeah.
bio
I mean,
or other
the
purposes
knowledge how to do nasty stuff
is
is
going to get out there. But the way
it
you
is,
stop it is you look for the behaviors, you look for the trends, and you do
yeah.
interdict. And so, it's and maybe it was just, maybe these people that were propagating this fear a year ago that AI was somehow going to create borrow highs really believed it, but maybe they were also borrowing from a playbook from the Gilded
There's
Age to
that.
create.
I think big tech has it's they're between the Scylla and Charybdis in several ways. So they would like to scare the government into making regulations that stops everyone but them from developing AI. Because if the regulations are onerous enough in terms of cost and paperwork, no one but a big tech company will be able to fill out the forms allowing you to deploy
No
AI.
new startups. Exactly.
On the other hand, you don't want to scare people so badly that they don't want to use the products or that the government actually stops big tech from doing their thing. So yeah, they want to scare people a bit, but not too badly. And they have very clever machine learning and NLP algorithms running, telling them exactly how to psych people out.
This is how you
So
can message it. Yes.
so as to do that, right? So yeah,
I would love to have an objective function that says, how do I help people overcome perceived learned helplessness and to take, steps on their own? That would be an interesting, more objective function to try.
so let me for a final question, let me selfishly pose you something of interest to me. So suppose you were leading an AGI project and you thought you had a chance of making a breakthrough toward human level AGI in the next, let's say, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Suppose you were a globally distributed team with people in many different countries and sort of rolling things out in a mix of centralized and blockchain based infrastructure. Suppose that you want to create AGI that will help people, right? And you sort of think that openness and decentralization is probably on the whole more likely to do that than the opposite. Then what what would you do to maximize your odds of success? I mean, setting aside the technical bit, so assuming the technical bit will work. I mean, that's always a risk. But then, what would you do to maximize the odds of public acceptance of what you're doing, to minimize the odds of governments sending thugs to your house to lock you
Right,
in a
right, right.
dungeon, right? Yeah.
Well, so I'd actually borrow a playbook from when another technological revolution threatened societies, which was about 1,000 years ago, give or take, when people could start, because of technological progress, you could live and then travel to and die in a different city than you were born in, which actually created some challenges, which is when this person shows up in this town saying that they're a lawyer, or they show up in this town saying they're an academic, or show up in this town saying they're a doctor, how do you know that they really have the knowledge of and the experience in doing that? How do you know they're not, they're the equivalent of a back then, a fake, deep fake equivalent? And then similarly, when that person, the person also faced the challenge when they show up in this town where they're not known by any in the town. How do they engender the trust of the public to provide their services? How do you know that that doctor, because you don't have medical knowledge yourself, is actually doing the best thing for you as opposed to something that's medically not necessary or the wrong thing? And the solution at the time was to develop the professions. Now, the professions had flaws and everything like that, but part of the professions was demonstrating of knowledge in, but also experience in, but most importantly, an ethical code, the Hippocratic Oath in the case of medicine and other things like that, that you had to actually have something bigger than your own self-interest as a professional. And the public was willing to let the professional societies self-police themselves insofar that they saw that that self-policing was effective. That if a question came up about malpractice about that doctor, other doctors would review and see if it was just a case of it was a bad outcome, that this was going to happen anyway, or things like that, or was it really malpractice? A bad decision was made that was incompetent, and that person needs to have their license either censored or removed. So I do the same thing with your distributed network. How do you demonstrate to the public of all nations that you are both requiring knowledge of, experience in, and an ethical oath for these people? And that if someone does something wrong, or if someone is engendering something wrong with the project, there is both a review and appropriate measures either to censor or remove that person from there. At the same time, the other thing I'd be thinking about is how do you make sure that if whatever reason something is going wrong or someone has given bad direction or misdirection to this activity, it's the multiple key holder approach. You don't launch a nuclear missile with one key. You have multiple keys that need to be turned by multiple people. I think that same approach. And again, but you have to demonstrate to the public that, why don't we have a certified data ethics degree? Why don't we have certified ethical AI people? We should. And then if we actually can see that they are realistically actually held to that higher standard and they have their licenses either censored or removed if they don't do it, I think that's going to be necessary, because armchair quarterbacking by people who aren't AI experts won't get us to where we need to go. But at the same time, if we don't require that higher standard, then how are you ever going to engender trust? And I would say, again, going back to our original conversation, maybe what we need to do for trust in AI, and if I define trust as demonstrating benevolence, competence, and integrity in your actions, are the same things we need to do to address trust in society as well. Again, benevolence, competence, and integrity. How can we demonstrate those three things as ways to move forward with trust in both society and AI as a whole?
Yeah. So that's interesting to me. from a variety of perspectives, and I start to think about it internationally as well. Like I lived in Hong Kong for 10 years and had a lot to do with the Beijing and Shenzhen AI and robotics worlds, and I mean I've also had close connections with the Russian AI community, and we seems like these different countries are just struggling about many more basic things, like not blowing up each other's allies, and I mean trying to keep hardware and software away from each other, and so forth. So then getting cooperation on stuff like this among these different countries would seem to require another level up beyond things that are
So if
even
you're waiting for the UN to step in, it's never going to happen. I think you have to put it
yeah
out there, and you have to recognize that some people, if they choose to join your activity, run the risk of either facing censure by their own nation, or you'd have to find ways to again demonstrate that they're acting in the interest of the collective,
yeah, because I
not.
mean China and Russia don't block people from using GitHub or Archive, right? So I mean there's a common recognition that global science and engineering is a global commons to everybody's benefit, and it's not talked about much, but it
We
but it
hope, we
is.
hope, we hope.
Well, so far it's true, right? I mean, so far, and I mean, in practice, like everyone in, I mean, Chinese tech companies are running algorithms developed at U.S. universities and then deployed at U.S. tech companies, and I mean, they know their developers are learning by making pull requests on Western GitHub code bases, right? Like, I mean, that's all there in practice, and no one is messing with it. Like right now, like when I'm in mainland China, GitHub is not behind the Great Firewall. At least last time I was there, whereas Google search is, right? So, I mean, partly that's because Microsoft plays nicely with the Chinese government, but I mean, it's also they
And
see
there was also, I think, a decade or so ago, Google had there were some unfortunate interactions that happened there, but
long,
we
long,
don't have to go
longer,
ahead and unpack that.
15 years ago or something. Yeah,
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 yeah.
exactly. They had an unfortunate experience. Yes.
Yeah, but so yeah, I suppose that the cooperation on decentralized AI development and the sort of certification that things are being done in an ethical, beneficial way. Yeah, this has to somehow be rolled out in the manner of GitHub or Archive, where it's something that people adopt because they realize it's for everybody's good, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't step on the toes of the things that the governments
Well, and
really
if I
want to
could also
control
just, I
tightly.
mean, if I could like almost summarize like what we've had this conversation so far is there's a larger trend happening over the last 40 years of which AI is just a part of, which is I tell people congratulations. The last 30 to 40 years, we have democratized capabilities that were only available to large nations, specifically their national security apparatus 40 years ago. It's worth noting. I've been told, you know where the first LLM was and when?
Where was the first large language model?
Yes, the first LLM. Yes, and
Depends.
what year or what decade?
I mean, it depends on how large is large, right? I mean, Transformers came out of the BERT model in
Yeah. So even before that, I've been told that the first LLM was actually in the 1960s with the NSA. So I raise that
well,
as
I,
a
I, I
larger.
don't I don't see how that could have been large by modern standards, just given the hardware that's available. Actually,
But again, the broader trend is your phone is a multi-int device. You can communicate with anybody in the world. You have more computing power than apparently President Reagan had in the early 1980s through his own access to what he could actually call upon with
yeah, probably.
DoD. And
No, I
you can
mean,
call satellite
look,
images. And
in
so,
in 89, 90, when I was an academic at University of Nevada, the state of Nevada got like a $10 million Cray YMP supercomputer. It had 1,000 SIMD parallel floating point processors, right? So
right.
I mean that. that $10 million machine that I was running machine
is now
learning,
able to fit in your pocket.
that
Yes.
it was much less capable than the GPU on this on this phone. The funny thing, the funny thing politically there was the state of Nevada accepted some nuclear waste dump, and to sweeten the pot, they threw in the supercomputer. Well, the supercomputer long since obsolete. The nuclear waste is still sitting there
Sadly,
near
yes, the half-life of computing versus the half-life of
yeah,
nuclear
yeah,
waste is not the same.
yeah.
But
Right.
so that's happening in this backdrop, and so it's worth noting that's challenging how nations operate just civilly, let alone from a security perspective. In that, if you're now dealing with, there's about 8.1 billion people on the planet. I think the estimates are about 5 billion have access to the internet at the moment. Not all of them have a smartphone, but let's say maybe 2 billion have a smartphone. And increasingly, that number is going to increase. What do you do when you have people with that capability as individuals, as collectives? And what does that mean about the future of organizing by nation state versus other ways? And so I just raise that because it's worth recognizing that everything you're planning with AI and AGI in the future is also happening in the backdrop of the good news is we're democratizing tech. The challenging news is we're democratizing tech. And again, this glass, if I break it, can also be used as a deadly weapon, and that's just the glass.
Well, yeah.
Happy thoughts. But I mean, again, it also recognized every decade,
Well, I mean,
has sort of
water is a deadly weapon. If you
yes,
inflate any of us like a water balloon,
excessive amounts of water. Yes, you need it to survive, but too much is bad. And so maybe we can hope for homeostasis in the decade ahead, at least.
that's right. That's right. So I'm about out of my time slot here, but I also think this has been a good
I
chunk
really
of
appreciate it. I look forward
good
to when we
chunk
can be in person and break bread. And thank you for everything you're doing to organize this event. And
Yeah,
really
yeah.
enjoy the
No,
conversation.
thanks a lot for sharing your thinking. So that it's great to get your sort of hands-on, beneficial AI policy mindset here, because I've been sort of neck deep in technology. Now AI technology is doing so many things. Suddenly, everyone's got to start thinking about the real world and human
Well, and I
reaction.
say this as someone who's both a technologist and I never really intended to do policy because I'm a nonpartisan and I don't ever want to run for office. But, at a certain point in time, tech runs into policy, whether it's dealing with satellites or with bio or with AI. And
Seems
so,
to be happening. Seems to be happening now with AI, and having done a bunch in the finance and medical space. That's very disturbing to me because I mean, you
oh, yeah.
see you see what can go wrong with regulations that are ultimately well intended, but yet, of course, some form of regulation, broadly speaking, is needed. We have to come together as a society to guide the AIs we're creating, right? And it's not like it's going to be unregulated in any case. There's a lot of regulations there now that are guiding things, right? So yeah, I look forward to the next conversation and digging in more depth into these things. And thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with the BGI 24 community.
Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate it.
All right, bye bye.
Bye bye.